Riddy looked over the rim of her canteen, eyeing the long line of human recruits standing idle in the grass. Her long lupine ears flicked with open aggravation at how they simply stood there, waiting for the rest of the non-humans to get their rest in after only rucking halfway to their training center. Riddy was a Kafia, children of the stars that found themselves bound in paw, snout, and fur. The early days during training had been rather interesting, as the humans poked fun at her and her fellow Kafia for being furries, and tried to weed them out via hazing. It was a fair bit of culture shock when Riddy had gone looking into her data slate for just what those were, and she feared humans for a whole other reason now, heaped onto all the others. She sighed out as she stared up at the big, angry, hot blue sky of Earth and closed her eyes, thinking back to what got her here in the first place. Humans had proved themselves to be the key in eliminating the star-wide threat of the Ur, a sadistic and highly aggressive race that was partially cybernetic. The Ur culture had deemed their natural avian wide-headed forms too weak to take what they believed was destined to be theirs. To combat this, they became nearly as much machine as humanoid, and took to the stars in a conquest of bloodshed. For the inner Dulcier coalition, things were grim nearly from the word go. The Ur had broken through so many blockades and fleets at once, it sent the entire IDC into complete disarray and panic, allowing the Ur to slowly bisect them all piece by piece. The Kafia were holding their own, as well as the Pwa, Kojin, and Lilgara, but it was a losing battle all the same. Planet after planet fell, swallowed whole to be consumed by the Ur war machine, and churned into materials to further their now swelling empire. The IDC was being pushed back at such a rapid pace that they were shunted out into the outer layers of the Milky Way, desperately searching for any child of the stars that could be recruited and help hold back the tide of the Ur. Some were found, mostly pacifists like the Gikiri, while others were still in their humble beginnings of life, no use even as cannon fodder. Things took a steep turn when a Kojin speed skipper found Earth, nearly ramming into it due to none of the skip charts showing it even being there. Kojin, with their carved metal masks and 2 sets of arms, were greeted warmly, despite the obvious alarm from Earth. The speed skipper recon vessel, finding itself quickly swarmed by point contact fighters and multiple frigates that bristled with more guns than any Kojin on board had ever seen on a war vessel. Humans were remarked by a Kojin wayfinder as the most boring race I had ever laid eyes on, but I knew I didn't want them to get a hold of me while angry, causing the Kojin to be as respectful as possible. The human language was quickly decoded by the Kojin, and there was a short burst of mirth as humans were recognized as the noisy neighbor, an IDC moniker given to the unknown race, blasting the stars with their incessant broadcasting. Kafia, Pwa, and Lilgara ships arrived within record time, pushing their skip engines as hard as they could to try and engage these newly discovered children of the stars. Humanity, as they called themselves, issued what many now see as warning signs. They didn't even need coaxing to join the IDC and fight, and took the offer with little more than, show us how we can get there. When skip engine technology was offered, the humans then asked for more ships. When more ships were given, humanity then asked, what are your rules of war, and how far can we go? It was an odd question. How far could they go? Neither the Kafia, Pwa, Kojin, or Lilgara knew how to even answer that question. They instead began to list the history of the Ur, showed them how they conducted themselves in battle, their many atrocities, as well as their utter disdain for mercy and the proper conduct of agreeable rules of war. When the humans heard of the desolation and extinction of the Ifrikana by Ur hands, the previously unknown race had a sudden shift in demeanor. We'll see it done. That's all that was said. All that humanity had found needing to be said. as the Unified American Authority and European Unified Council marched in lockstep to war. Their previous bickerings and skirmishes were wiped clean from the board as they now had a common enemy, an enemy that was as unjust as they were vile. Humanity, after all, loved an enemy they could hate. Their ships arrived in good order to a planet under siege from the Ur, and the bloodletting that filled the news unsettled many within the Inner Dulcier coalition. The Katja and Poix saw the humans as a monster they had now unwittingly let out of their cage. The Kojin and Lilgara saw the humans as a beacon of hope, warriors of good that fought with an instilled rage and conviction that they had never laid eyes on before in the history of their stars. To the Ur, humanity would end up being their obliteration. The headsmen pulled from the shadows of the void by their enemies. The Ur went from years of victories to conducting a final, bitter last stand on their home planet of Zahari 1. After nearly a decade of constant warring and killing amongst the stars of the Milky Way, humanity drew from their armory a weapon capable of splitting a planet in two. A final gift and farewell they held in special regards to beings they saw deserving of being reduced to a mere memory. They went further than what was even required of their weapons, reducing Zahari 1 to crags of rock floating in space, turning the once grand planet of interstellar control and power to nothing more than the dust of grand plans and lofty ambitions of domination. Humanity made sure nothing breathing left the planet at all, and after a further year of hunting, declared the Ur extinct from the star record. Humanity, disgusted by the Ur, had reduced them to nothing more than words and pictures. Impressed and mildly terrified, the Katja, Poix, and Lilgara sent their own soldiers to Earth in order to learn from these butcherers of iron. And it was because of this Riddy found herself there now. Riddy had been a special operations trooper of her race's main home planet, Katja Mintulker, and had been participating in the grand cleanup of the Ur remnants. With her job now over, her mother had made it quite clear that she was to now get married and help rebuild the populations of Katja. Instead, Riddy hopped on the first ship off that damn planet. It was a good gig anyway, even though Earth was both hotter and had a higher gravity than her home planet. She had rode there with the Poix and Lilgara, and the ride was eventful, to say the least. Riddy had not known much about the other star children until the war, and she still found them odd. The Poix were shorter than her, averaging at about 5 foot even, and had both pointed ears and many features that were akin to humans, while the Katja had paw-like hands and mildly digitigrade legs. The Poix could very well have just been odd, shorter cousins of the humans. Despite their pointed ears and thickly fibered hair, they also had rather odd eyes. While they were a normal shape, which was an odd similarity that everyone but the Ur shared, they were fully colored. The color deepened around the rims and came to a lighter hue near the middle, giving them an oddly gem-like quality. The Lilgara were an odder people and only shared the general construction of their hands and feet with the humans. While they were lizard-like with rounded noses, thick tails, and slitted pupils that burned as if filled with the fire of rising suns, they had great, loose hoods around their heads. These could be flared out, depending on the Lilgara's emotion, and normally sat around the neck in folds of lightly scaled flesh, making them all look as if they were constantly wearing cowled sweaters under their usual clothing. This remnant of their evolution was mostly bothersome, but it did wonders in hiding things such as snacks or drinks. Then there were the Katja, and Riddy pondered about it for a moment. The humans, despite calling them furries, had apparently fallen upon a similar design in their own literature, something that fascinated the Katja to no end. Space wolves was used often, while other humans believed they were more vulpine, owing to their more refined snouts and far more attractive faces. They had tails much like the Lilgara, but instead of being long, strong, and scaly, Theirs was just an extension of their spine and covered with fur, much like any other creature. Their fur colors were varied: white, black, red. If there was a color out there, it was likely a Katja wore it at one time. Small designs in their coats sometimes arose, such as freckles of darker colors, dots, stripes, etc., while their eyes were said to shine like the minerals hidden beneath soil. Riddy thought that her given color was a bunch of bullshit. She had been born icterine yellow, with a splash of marigold freckles across her face, a rarer color, and had ivory eyes to boot. The Katja military had refused her several times for service just for how loud she was color-wise, and had tried to make her become a nurse. After enough pestering to drive even a human mad, they finally let her join a Special Forces shock infantry unit, since they usually went in loud anyway. Her sister and mother were both nearly goldenrod in color, with eyes that shone like mother of pearl, but they both went into fashion as their chosen professions. She had gotten the same kind of razzing from the humans when she had landed, with one drill sergeant remarking that he could wear her as a PT belt. The planet itself, Earth, as the humans called it, was less than comfortable. She had landed in something called a state, of which was called Georgia. Learning how to say Georgia had been a task in of itself, though the name of the fort was rather fun to say. Fort Benning was a military installation renowned for training parachute-dropped soldiers during the earlier years of its creation, and now was the premier training grounds for drop-pod-borne infantry. Unfortunately, for Riddy and everyone else in her training unit, their planets had signed them up for the hardest and toughest training school for the Unified American Authority military, Heavy Onslaught Infantry. In their own minds, the human training should have been easy, according to their governments and councils, and this would be proof that they were, despite the outcome of the war, on equal footing with humans when it came to power and strength. Besides the blistering heat, air that felt like it was made from lead and suffering, and all the nanomedical inoculations, Riddy and the other star children had weeks of in-classroom learning. First, they had to learn the language, which wasn't all that difficult, as well as acclimate to the higher gravity. This was just a lot of working out in air-conditioned gyms, and they all bounced back rather quickly, some faster than others. With a gravity rating of 14.5 ppd, and the average being 8 to 9 ppd on other planets within the IDC, Earth was a real pain to get used to. Their teacher was a rather odd woman, one of the Scalathir race that mostly aided in the war by financial and material means. They were a robust, scaled people that radiated strength and poise, but were far different than the Logara. The Scalathir were far more blocky, less refined, a feature of their own evolution and time spent digging the ground apart for its minerals. Scalathir were master miners, refiners, and workers, crafting and forging some of the strongest metals known to the stars, and their muscular figures made them of keen interest to the humans. The humans nearly as a whole were taken in by their curved horns, strong features, and toil-crafted bodies, leading the Scalathir councils to take a tight grip on their own people who tried to immigrate to Earth. Human attention was, according to the Scalathir, highly addictive, and the Scalathir were years ahead of everyone else in regard to working with humans, due to helping them build their ships and armors for the war. Lathway Omla, or Miss La as she preferred to be called, was the first Scalathir that Riddy had seen with her own eyes. The woman was, well, she was huge, standing at nearly 7.5 UAA feet. The blue-scaled woman looked as if she could snap her desk in half with her well-muscled tail alone. According to the brief biography portfolio on their data slates, she had been an armor forger before taking a teaching commission on Earth, and was apparently several months overdue returning home. Her horns arched back towards the rear of her skull, and she had several long strands of scaled flesh that ran down the sides of her face. Every once in a while, the strands would twitch if Miss Law became angry or agitated at her students, and Riddy made a distinct measure to not ask what the hell they were. When they had a firm grasp on English, Miss Law then left to return to an orbiting station, leaving her students to the whims of their new instructors. On her home planet of Kafia Mintulkur, her military training had been no different than any normal college or place of learning. There were classes, range days, physical training 3 times a week, and there was a cordial respect between all soldiers, instructor and trooper alike. When she was told to leave the bus and stand on a pair of painted boot prints on the sidewalk, she couldn't help but raise her eyebrows. She almost spoke out in Kafia High, but remembered to instead use English. "What the hell is this?" Riddy asked, turning to look at a brown-furred female Kafia to her left as sweat began to form under her shirt. The heat was just as unbearable today, and they had not been allowed to wear Kafia environmental suits for some reason, instead issued the olive drab uniform, white shirt, and newly made paw boots. The woman shrugged, pursing her lips as her tail gave a curious sway. "Perhaps we are being scanned." "What would they scan for?" Riddy began, but both she and the brown-furred Kafia snapped to the position of attention when a growling voice barked out over all the mild chatter.
"Shut your damn mouths! Furry feet on the boots, now!"
Riddy's heart rate spiked in fear as she turned her head left and right, trying to see who was speaking.
"Stop looking around, furball! Eyes straight, arms to your sides!"
The voice bellowed out again as recruits poured from the buses. Leave it to the humans to still use vehicles with rubber wheels of all things. Not that the ride was unpleasant. It was just archaic. As fast as they could, over 2,000 recruits from beyond the clouds of Earth poured into their marks. A mixture of Kafia, Pwa, and Lilgara. There were over 1,000 humans as well, but they were sectioned off into their own places to stand.
"What's happening?"
A male Lilgara muttered behind Riddy, and her ears turned to the sides to hear him better.
"Why are they yelling at us? Did we do something wrong?"
A male Pwa standing on Riddy's right turned his head as far as he dared, muttering out of the side of his mouth.
"I think it's the beginning."
"What's beginning?" Riddy muttered back, her ears flicking back and forth as she heard someone crying near the rear of their formation.
"Our training."
The Pwa sighed out, his head already slicked with sweat.
"This is the breaking period."
Riddy wanted to ask him what the hell he was talking about, but before she could turn her head, a boot connected with the doors leading to the forging halls, the reception building for new recruits. 2 double doors slammed into brick walls with a tortured rattle of steel and puff of dust, and from those doors poured hundreds of male and female humans, all wearing round brown hats bearing brass badges on their fronts. Riddy didn't even understand half of what they were saying as they streamed into formations, moving around them like a river breaking free of a bank and coursing around rather confused and scared rocks. Before a mere 30 seconds had passed, Kafia, Pwa, and Lilgara were breaking ranks and making runs for the buses.
"That's right, run!"
An extremely short female drill sergeant howled, her face marked and scarred by her war wounds, badges of honor amongst human warriors. Despite being a mere 5'5", she had the aura of a 9-foot-tall Scalithier magma smith.
"Run for those bushes, you little sons of bitches! You come here and make a mockery of my army!"
The woman twitched left, moving so quickly that Riddy had thought she teleported. Her equally scarred fists gripped Riddy by the front of her uniform blouse, pulling the 5'9" Kafia down to her eye level.
"Are you gonna run and hide, you little furry shit?"
The drill sergeant bellowed into her face, shaking Riddy as if she were a toddler.
"You gonna piss yourself and hide under the seat?"
Riddy saw from the scant second of pause, her name was Almore. A second quick thought of her rank, Riddy remembered seeing a single rocker. Staff Sergeant Almore.
"No, Staff Sergeant Almore!"
Riddy stammered out, and tried not to make any noise as the human shook her again roughly.
Staff Sergeant! Staff Sergeant! I am Drill Sergeant Almore to you, you fucking fur-licking cretin!
Drill Sergeant Almore bellowed as she threw Riddy to the ground, knocking the air from the Kafia's lungs.
Push! Push, you little bitch!
Riddy, at a loss of what to do, began doing push-ups. She only got 3 reps out before Drill Sergeant Almore grabbed her by an ear.
You bore me, recruit! Bore me! Get up! Get up off my goddamn concrete!
Drill Sergeant Almore screamed, hauling the painfully hissing Riddy to her feet before turning and finding a new target, pointing a scarred hand at a female Lilgara.
You! I saw you looking at me, snake shit! Who the fuck do you think you're looking at?
Riddy shuddered and trembled as she stood at attention on her boots, her eyes fighting back humiliated tears as the yelling continued around her.
The fuck was that?
They're waiting us out,
the male Poi murmured, not even daring to look as if he was breathing.
210 have already fled. 23 are currently sprinting through the fucking wood line.
The attack was sudden, violent, and then they were gone. The overwhelming calm and quiet was nearly as unnerving as the drill sergeants being there, but no one dared to move their heads and look around. No one was brave enough to obtain the sudden ire and rage of the drill sergeants if they happened to still be nearby. Indeed, Riddy and the other Kafia could hear the drill sergeants some ways away, as well as the panicked screams of those who fled. But Riddy alone could hear the fact there were drill sergeants still near, lurking around the back of the buses, waiting. Riddy had never been stalked before, and she did not find the feeling to her liking. A new sound broke the quiet, a pair of polished black combat boots calmly stepping along the sidewalk. The soft click and scrape of the heels made Riddy's fur stand on end. Blinking at the sweat that stung her eyes, and she gave a soft puff of air out her nose to clear the sweat from there as well. A male human stepped out into all of their view, and he lifted his head. It was as if someone had carved a human from a block of stone, and the man's uniform struggled to hide the warrior's form he held underneath it.
Right face,
he said calmly, and everyone snapped to the right. They all turned in their own way. Kafia soldiers changed directions to the right by lifting their left foot paw, kicking it out to swing right, and then planting their foot paw back to the ground. The Poi shifted off the toes of their right foot, pushing off of their left and bringing their feet back together. The Lilgara swung their heads and tails in a swishing motion, rapidly picking up their feet in a marching motion and coming to a halt at their attentive position. With the human now in view, Riddy's eyes were drawn to his brown campaign hat. His brass badge was different, bearing 2 crossed combat bayonets behind the usual emblem. This told everyone that he was not only a drill sergeant that was a combat veteran, but a veteran who saw combat on the 10 major battleground planets controlled by the Ur. A senior drill sergeant, a double dagger, as they were nicknamed according to their briefing folders on the data slates. His quiet voice and pleasant demeanor was perhaps even more unsettling than the noise of the other drill sergeants.
Welcome to Fort Benning, Georgia,
he said, smiling to them all as sweat coursed down their bodies.
It appears you have lost some weight in number, but that is fine. You will lose more before the week is out. I am curious, though, to see just how many of you will last until the end and earn your mark of honor.
The reception building loomed behind him like an execution chamber, the tall, ancient drop tower standing behind it like sentinels.
You will all be staying in the airborne barracks, walking and treading the same path as millions of humans have before you.
He continued, slowly speaking in front of them all.
Their spirit, their sweat, their pain. It will all be intertwined with yours as you learn, become stronger, are forged sharper, and honed deadlier. By the time you leave this place,
The senior drill sergeant partially turned, opening his arms to the ancient airborne barracks, the old drop towers and newer pod base, all while smiling.
your own people won't even recognize you.
He finished, then pulled off the data slate from his belt.
As it is, we will first start with you all being issued your gear, as well as more uniforms. That single one you are wearing won't do, but we knew not many of you would be sticking around, so I issue more than we would care to receive again.
He chuckled to himself, and the doors to the reception building opened again like a great maw ready to consume them. Outfitting had been just as chaotic and rigorous as their initiation on the sidewalk. They all stood in lines being measured by the staff of the building or scanned by handheld machines. They were issued a CAC card after their pictures were taken, and Riddy was annoyed at how frightened she looked in hers. She looked as if she had been thrown out an airlock, eyes wide, hair frayed. Even her cheek fur was standing on end with stress. She had made up her mind that if she survived the training, she would get a new one taken. Showing this one to other military officials would just be embarrassing. At the end of their many scans, measurements, and digital signatures, a tidy rucksack was waiting for them with their name on it. They were all of human make, great big monsters that were wide and nearly twice that in height. Inside were her 7 uniforms. 7 PT uniforms, extra paw boots, socks, her patrol caps with their half-moon cutouts for her ears, as well as other gear for the rest of the hellish Earth seasons. The humans had done their homework on the otherworldly races from the stars, as they had included ear picks for the Pwa, a Kafia grooming kit including multiple curved shears, and Lilgara scale scrapers. "Toss on that ruck and head to the intake armory. You'll get your rifle as well," a woman said, jerking her thumb over her shoulder. "Hubba hubba, dog girl." Dog girl? Riddy thought to herself with a silent growl in her throat, but slung on the massive pack onto her shoulders and trudged off to the armory. The armory itself seemed more like a temple, more than an armory. Along the walls were weapons of humanity's past, arranged like icons of religious importance with little plaques next to them. She turned her head to see one such older weapon, narrowing her eyes at the plaque and working through the English letters slowly. Brown Bess Smooth Bore Musket? Riddy leaned in a little further as she muttered, "Musket, smooth bore, ramrod loaded." She blinked at the old weapon, then shook her head, moving down the line, talking to herself as others read or moved quickly past them. Springfield Model 1795. 1795? This thing is
322 years old, give or take a few years. I'm not quite sure how their calendars work yet.
Riddy turned and saw the male Pwa from earlier was looking at the same rifle as her, reading the plaque with the same eye as a professional student. "You again," Riddy said, turning to face the Pwa. He had dull white hair, nearly gray, but eyes that looked as if she were looking at a nebula through a telescope. He was 5'2", maybe 3, and looked a little more rugged than the other Pwa she had seen. "Military?"
We all are. I just got more work done.
The Pwa said, offering a hand to Riddy.
Name's Alias.
Riddy cracked a grin, and Alias held up the offered hand.
Yeah, I already know.
"Riddy," the yellow Kafia offered, holding out her own hand that was quickly taken by Alias. "What are our numbers? You seemed to be keeping track earlier."
I'm not actually sure. I saw quite a few sneaking out of the building, but they're breaking us up into something called training companies. There's going to be 400 of us, all mixed together with the humans.
Alias said, turning and slowly walking down the long hallway towards the armory. Riddy followed after him, watching the weapons slowly evolve as they went down the hallway. Odd little weapons such as the Krag Jorgensen, the M1903 Springfield, Garand, M1 carbine, all the way down the wall until they came before the current modern issue rifle, the SR-113 Mod 2. It was a deceptively vague-looking thing. It was a weapon of simplistic beauty and attractive lines, yet blocky and utilitarian in design. The barrel was capped with an odd-looking device that both reduced recoil and allowed for the attachment of what looked like a can, of all things, poking out of the foregrip with the block that fed the piston the gas it needed to operate the weapon. The magazine was flared, boasting an impressive 40-round capacity thanks to the brick of the magazine that fed the weapon. The buttstock collapsed down against the frame via 2 sliding rails, allowing the stock to sit flush to the rear of the weapon via a telescoping mechanism. The grip to the weapon was bulky, but it at least had some curves to it for comfort. To Riddy and Alias, it looked nearly Neolithic.
We were all using pulse rifles, Gaur rail carbines, laser crop emitters,
Alias said with an annoyed narrowing of his eyebrows, looking at the rifle as if it would bite him if he touched it.
Then these guys show up with lead throwers. This thing killed all the Ur.
Riddy shrugged. The Ur had the best shields in the game, and their bodies were pretty much the power cells. If you couldn't blow parts of them away, it always came down to melee. The weapons of humans blew chunks off of the Ur. The rounds were so slow, the shields didn't even register them as attacks.
Alias shook his head, walking on. Remember when we found out they could shatter their steel bones and turn them into blades?
It was a massacre. That's what it was, Riddy said, remembering the recordings taken of the 1046's last moments on Elihi. They thought they had finally ground them down and had no more ammunition, all to just be butchered on the rocks. Riddy and Alias came to the armory proper, and it was even more temple-esque in here. Racks of rifles were held aloft in rotating racks, slowly spinning and depositing a rifle when the correct serial number was found, as mechanical arms picked and plucked at weapons. Around the walls were parts from millions of rifles, pistols, and crew-served weapons through human time, arranged in blackened steel, Art Deco designs. On plinths made of brass casings were artifacts, helmets bearing the marks of battle, combat vests, and armor still stained by the detonations of Ur munitions, twisted and still blooded blades sitting upon welded V's of brass casings. The lack of natural light and moodier attitude about the place made it feel as if they were in a tomb. Artifacts from the war, Riddy whispered, pointing to one such dagger. That blade took the final Ur life. They flayed the Ur alive, something called a blood eagle. Alias nodded, pointing to a helmet with dozens of incense burners around it.
First human trooper to be killed in battle wore that helmet. I remember it from a few books I read on the way here. William T. Turner.
As Riddy looked around, there were actually a lot of incense burners in here, filling the armory with the smell of sandalwood, black powder, carbon, and the very smell of fire itself. It was during this observation that she realized the humans in this area were not nearly as normal as the others. Curiously enough, while they still wore uniforms of olive drab, they wore great leather gloves inscribed with stars at the fingers, while from the wrist and below were bands of bars, the gloves running all the way to 2 inches before the elbow. Around their heads were heavy woolen hoods of more olive drab, cropped out to shed shadows down their faces. The hoods gathered around their necks as if to protect them from the cold, pouring down their shoulders and hanging just an inch above the ground, perfectly level. Oddest of all were their pauldrons, blocky outcrops of drop armor emblazoned with the emblem of a firing pin crossed behind the notched face of a rifle bolt. Armorers, Riddy whispered, and Alias turned, not realizing the humans had finally shown themselves. Armorers were revered amongst the humans, as each armorer had to serve at least 10 years in the military, as well as serve in active combat zone and shed blood. When a human became an armorer, That was the job they held until they died. And Riddy saw an older armorer with a long gray beard braided down from the front of his uniform. A second glance around the armory told her that there were no more human recruits here. It was all off-worlders, and the old armorer stepped out from behind the rifle counter.
"Today, you receive your rifle,"
he said, flexing his shoulders. Riddy could tell that even in his aged state, the man could likely kill more than half of the room in one-on-one combat.
"You will be issued one rifle and one rifle only. You will bear your rifle until you either finish your tenure within these armed forces or fall upon the field of battle. If such a fate should befall you, your rifle will be buried with you, and no one else will ever bear it. Some of you may gain a rifle with a name upon it. This is the name of its previous owner, and their warrior spirit will be with you. And should you leave, your name will then be laid upon it. No matter what comes in the future, no matter what new weapon may come along, you will only bear the rifle you are given now. Its number will be etched into your very flesh, and you shall become one of the same soul."
The older human man pulled off one of his gloves, and there upon his forearm was a long string of numbers, ending with the same notched facing of a rifle bolt.
"You are not human, but you shall be baptized in the soul of powder, lead, and flame."
He nodded his head as the long tendrils of incense smoke drifted across the air that hung between him and the off-world recruits.
"With these rifles forged of iron and steel, crafted by human hands, you shall become more than what you arrived as. You shall become equal."
The older human slowly stepped backwards. With a raised, gloveless hand, he snapped his fingers, the ceiling becoming a crawling, writhing mass of mechanical apparatuses as rifles were pulled from their storage racks. 10 mechanical arms slowly swung down from the ceiling, presenting 10 rifles to the armorers who bent down, running a gloved hand along their serial numbers and scanning them into the tattoo machine that would stamp the same numbers onto the flesh of the recruits standing before them.
"Do not dishonor the steel and iron. Do not dishonor the human spirit within these rifles. Do not dishonor yourselves."
The older human intoned with finality, slamming his gloved and ungloved hands together with an ear-ringing clap. The mechanical arms spun around and presented the rifles they bore, the SR-113 Mod 2s catching the dull light as incense smoke drifted slowly across them. Much to Riddy's disappointment, 27 more children of the stars bowed forward and stepped back, unable to bear the weight of such duty, and they were quietly ushered out of the room by hidden drill sergeants that had been lingering in the shadows. The older human smiled, his teeth just barely visible under his hood.
"You there, in the yellow, choose your rifle."
Riddy, an elite soldier of her peoples, had chosen a rifle with 3 names etched upon it, rifle number 33K96578-3. Was now etched onto her right forearm, and it itched terribly. But she walked out of the armory with the rifle on her shoulder and her rucksack on her back. She couldn't explain the feeling she had within her chest, but she felt heavier than when she had first arrived, as she walked down a long, thin concrete walkway towards a slowly growing formation. She casted her eyes to the rifle, reading the names again. R.C. Brola, Matthew Irwin, Ronald Dodden. Riddy whispered, looking at the number on her arm again. Did they bear the same number as her? Did she share a brotherhood of warriorhood with these 3 humans? Would they hate sharing a number with a non-human? Should she meet them one day? She didn't know, despite her wanting to. While waiting in a white circle on the ground, along with other white circles, she saw Alias join the formation, and she smiled at him. Alias showed his forearm, and he smiled back, winking at her and looking around at their growing training company. It was a hard mix of humans, Kafia, Pwa, and Lilgara, with maybe an even split of humans to offworlders. Their drill sergeants, all 12 of them, stalked around the formation, calm for the moment, and allowing idle chatter as long as it was quiet.
It itches.
Someone hissed beside Riddy, and she turned her head to the Lilgara. He was a younger one and had a scale across his round nose, denoting him as coming from the northern region of his planet. "I remember your voice. You were behind me earlier," Riddy said, holding out her own right arm to him. He looked up and smiled, exposing his needle-like teeth.
Ah, the Kafia with the sun-colored fur. Good to see you didn't pussy out like the others.
"Pussy out?" Riddy asked, and it actually caused a drill sergeant nearby to cough out a laugh. He cleared his throat before continuing his walk. "It means to get scared and run away like a little bitch, recruit." "Oh," Riddy said with raised eyebrows and wide eyes, then turned back to the Lilgara. "No, I did not." The Lilgara took her hand, shaking it. Honestly, shaking hands was an odd amount of fun and was apparently a human custom they all had to learn. Their entire classroom practicing shaking hands had ended up on the Human Interlinked Information Network, and it was quite popular, even now.
I'm Shasta,
the Lilgara said, smiling brightly. Alias gave a snort. "Oh no."
What?
Shasta asked, turning around to look at the Pwa. Alias pulled out his data slate, a newer issue that attached to his belt, and pulled up the particular brand of soda that was quite popular in the early 2100s, before it went bankrupt. Shasta stared at the slate for a long while, his face souring as he slowly scrolled down the information logs on the display. He then looked to Riddy.
This training cycle is going to suck.
And that was Chapter 1 of the Drop Pod Green Sci-Fi series. If you like these stories and others like them, be sure to subscribe to Guard Bros Field Desk, join us on Discord, or become a member on the Ko-fi. Ko-fi members get a special channel on the Discord, sneak peeks at future chapters, as well as access to the works in progress of all artwork. Our first shirts are Charles White, Optimus Primus, Allspark 113, E-Machine O, Cody Jarrow, Death's Dancer, and Insane Medic. The members of E4 Mafia are James Buckner, Sonic Arrow, Splug the Goblin, Darkside, Kiwi Bastard, Lacunai 8, Lacunai, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, and Crusader 0625. And then there's Snuffy Squad, with Split Iris Bear, Mika, Aaron Wilbur, Damon Bain Plays, Scott Anderson, Vertus, Damon McQuinn, Super Stink 64, Elder Rock, Croman, Dal-3K, Jules, Blonde Lord, Thrace Vega, Devin Sean Holtz, Andrew N. Gill, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Classy Cthulhu, Ranger Uninspired, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, and 13.2 X14mm Ein. Until we see you next time on this side of the veil, I'm Larissa, and this is Guard Bros Field Desk.